So today we're going to actually start talking about getting those traits and what those traits mean and how those traits come to be in what you are. And of course it's from our genetics, and we're going to start using the terminology that Mendel discovered when he worked with his pea plants. All right, and two of those terms that we're going to talk about are dominant and recessive. Now, simple traits are controlled by alleles. Now, alleles control all traits, and an allele is a different form for a single gene. Okay, so your traits are frequently controlled by just one gene. So, like whether or not you have an earlobe. All right, and there are two forms of that. Okay, some people have a free earlobe that actually hangs down, like mine. Okay, or some people have that earlobe that just comes down and attaches to their head. They don't have that little flap down there. So there's two forms. Those two forms are possible because of alleles. Because the one gene that determines earlobe has two possibilities. So it's different forms for a single gene. And so when we're talking about simple traits, you only have two: dominant and recessive. Okay? Those alleles that we're talking about here are represented by letters of the alphabet. It's just what scientists chose, letters of the alphabet. And you can pick any letter you want. But there are a couple of things that are always the same. So as you can see, just pick some letters. But a capital letter is always going to be used to designate dominant. So a capital letter is dominant. It's the big letter, so it's the dominant allele. And a lowercase letter is always going to be used to represent a recessive allele. Little letter. So it's the lesser recessive allele. So dominant and recessive. Capital is dominant, lowercase is recessive. All right, now, dominant traits are controlled by alleles in which you only need one of them for that trait to show up. So you only need one of these alleles for it to be seen, okay? So it doesn't matter if you have two dominant alleles, so for example a big A, or if you have one dominant and one recessive, big A, little a. Either one of these is going to make that trait show up. Because it's dominant, it dominates. And what happens when you dominate? You take over. And so this trait is always going to take over the actual physical appearance because it's dominant. So that's why it doesn't matter if you have two of them or if you only have one of them, because this one is going to dominate. Right? Now, for a recessive trait to actually be seen, to show up, okay, they have to have alleles that you can only see them if both alleles are the same and both are recessive. You have to have two recessive alleles to see a recessive trait. So it has to be little a, little a. Because remember, even though this is recessive, the dominant is going to take over. It's going to be the one that shows up because it's going to dominate. So if you want to see a recessive trait in an individual, it has to be two recessive alleles. The dominant has to be gone so that you can see the recessive. Right? And this is an example, like I said, ears, okay, about dominant and recessive. A free earlobe where it actually dips down and then goes back up before it attaches, that's a dominant trait. So big A will give you a free earlobe, and so will big A, little a. Right? But if your ear comes down and attaches without going back up first, that's recessive. And the only way to have that trait is to have two recessive alleles. Little a, little a. All right? So the thing to take away from this is that a dominant allele, if you have it, that's the one that's always going to show up. And the only way to have a recessive trait show up is you have to have all recessive alleles. You got to get rid of the dominant to see a recessive.